Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out Saving Green. Today we're going to talk about some other considerations that you should have in the back of your mind before you go solar. Alright, so in the last video we talked a little bit about how to estimate your upfront costs, including financing, and just to get some rough numbers to understand whether or not solar financially makes sense. But there's actually a lot that you need to think about before you go ahead with the planning to get solar panels up on your roof. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to think long term. If you're going to be in your home for less than 10 years, it probably doesn't make sense because you're either going to have to figure out a way to transfer the property value over to the new owner, in which case contracts and mortgage subordination can come into play, and it tends to be a little bit more complicated. Additionally, in a shorter period of time, you're not going to really be benefiting from the additional costs that you may be outlaid initially based on the amount of time that you're benefiting from the solar panels. Again, this is a comparison between your utility monthly rates and your financing rates. The second thing you want to do is you want to check your HOA. You have to make sure that you're even allowed to get panels on your roof, and if so, what steps you may need to take when the time comes for the installation to be permitted, that you can move ahead without any other hiccups. The third thing, and perhaps the most important and also the most time consuming, is to really get a deep dive into your energy usage and try to figure out which ways you can become more efficient. Namely, think about big item things. For example, your AC units, your water heaters, your refrigeration, and always on systems, whether it be updating your TVs to an LED or an OLED panel, things like that. You can finally tell your wife that you have a reason to upgrade to a new TV if it's actually a lot less efficient. You can even look at the little yellow energy stripes on those particular appliances to see kind of how energy efficient they may be. Of course, Energy Star ratings and things like that are important. They often will give you a price estimate, based on the total kilowatt hours that the appliance demands, what your annual costs may be. If you can figure out a way to budget in new air conditioning units or a new water heater, you could substantially cut your outlay of about maybe 20 to 30%. And it's a lot more efficient if you can pay for it up front and to include that additional cost into the size of the panel. The fourth thing you want to look at is the condition and age of your roof. An average roof may last 20 to 30 years, depending on the composition. So you want to make sure that your roof is either midlife or early life so that it will last the time it takes to get the panels installed, and make sure that you're not going to have to take the panels down and get your roof repaired. So you want to check for leaks, you want to check for any obvious visible damage or erosion on the roof. And just to note that when your contractor comes out to do the final assessment, they will of course look at the roof, look at where the panels will be installed, and make sure that any issues are addressed. But it may be a good idea just to look back through the documents in your home to make sure that your roof isn't too old. Now, one consideration to also think about is other types of solar panels. For example, solar tiles from Tesla actually are the shingle themselves, but they tend to be a lot more expensive per watt, and the durability and availability of these isn't really universal. For example, in South Florida, I don't believe that they're hurricane grade. So for Miami-Dade and Palm Beach County, you really need to make sure that we can survive a Category 5 hurricane. So those panels, unfortunately, are not an option for us. But just kind of keep that in mind and kind of think long term. If you need to get your roof replaced, do that advanced, maybe bundle it with the install, or consider some of the other newer options like the solar roof. Now, the fifth thing that you need to think about, again, is just get a sense of the components of your installation. And of course, that is the size in each panel, that's measured in watts, the total quantity, we discussed that in the last video, and then how the documentation and the information about each panel is conveyed to you. So you'll see information, for example, like the overall efficiency of each panel, which is somewhere between 15 and 22%. The degrade rate, how much as a percentage of efficiency or productivity you lose year after year. You can estimate about 1 to 2% per year. The warranty of each panel, whether or not it's a full manufacturer's warranty that includes installation and repairs, which things may be covered and which things may be not. These are discussions that you would want to have with your contractor. And the other thing is the type of solar panel that you have installed. There are different tiers. There's tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 panels based on the manufacturing record of each supplier. So overall efficiency and durability of each panel, and then of course how the panels will be engineered is certainly important. Now, one other thing to note is that you'll see different efficiency ratings as STC versus NOCT. So STC is kind of your ideal standard conditions rating. It's a fixed temperature, there's no wind. It kind of is your best overall ideal scenario that's not realistic in practical terms. Your NOCT accounts for kind of real life fluctuations in terms of wind speed, cloud coverage, and things like that. That's going to be a much lower rating, sometimes 25, 30% less, but that's going to be your practical output. Keep in mind these numbers are comparable in terms of manufacturer to manufacturer. You have to look at both values. So for example, for a panel to have a really high STC rating and a really low NOCT rating, then you really might want to look at the NOCT ratings as kind of an apples to apples comparison, so you kind of know what you're getting into. Of course, you've got your panels. You also have your inverters. Your inverters convert your DC, which is the direct current energy that the sunlight is actually radiating onto the panel, and then your AC is actually what the conversion rate is, so you're going to lose about 10 to 50% there. You can get kind of a complete system inverter, which tends to be a little bit more cost effective, but these panels are going to be arranged in serial, and if one of them goes down, your whole system could go down. Parallel construction with microinverters is really the way to go. That's the way most installers are doing it these days. That's what we have in our roof. That allows you to kind of pick and choose each panel, look at each panel's efficiency individually, and update and modify panels in a one-to-one situation, so you don't have to kind of look at all the systems together. So microinverters is just something to think about. It's how your energy company is going to be assessing your production. It's an AC. That's what all the appliances and all the electricity that you use in your home is actually using. It's not DC, so there is a little distinction there. In my last video, I didn't really get into the difference between DC and AC, but just keep in mind that when you're looking at your overall energy demand, you need to add about 15% or so to give you a DC value of what the panel size will actually be. So the sixth thing that you want to consider is whether or not you want to be on the grid or off the grid. If you're on the grid, that's really practical for most urban, suburban areas. It allows you to be tied into the electrical grid system from your utility company, and it requires a thing called net metering, where your electrical supplier will monitor your demand, your usage, and your production overall, and kind of give you some estimate as to how much you're using versus how much you're producing. And that metering usually requires a small fee, monthly fee. In our case, it's about $10 a month, but we found that it's still worthwhile. If you want to go off the grid, you have to think about battery backup, and then you have to think about what system you're going to be using. If you're going to keep everything in DC, it's more efficient to kind of get a DC conversion directly from the panels to the DC storage in your battery, as opposed to converting to AC and then back to DC to your battery. These are really complex issues. You can look at other YouTube channels and other online resources to get better information about that. But bottom line, for saving green, I do not recommend getting an energy backup with a battery at this time. I think that the cost per kilowatt hour is too expensive, and I don't think it makes sense, at least in our mind. Miscellaneous things I just want to address quickly, and that is that depending on the size of your system, you may need additional permits from the state, and they will often, your contractor should handle those for you, but there may be additional fees. And additionally, if you have a certain size system, I think it's over 11 kilowatts, you may be grouped into what's called like a tier 2 system, which means that you may also need umbrella insurance, which is an additional rider on your homeowner's insurance or property insurance. You can often bundle this with your auto insurance provider. Another thing to keep in mind is whether or not you want to get surge protection, which is a way to kind of provide an additional warranty on your service. So if your panel system gets struck by lightning, will that be covered? In our case, we thought it was worthwhile. Again, it's an additional $10 a month. So these are just some other things to think about, again, before you go ahead with solar. The eighth thing that I want you to consider is asking around. Make sure that you get a good comparison from at least 3 different comparable and competent suppliers. And you submit your inquiry online. You're gonna basically type in your zip code, you're gonna type in your energy bill, and then you're gonna get called. You're gonna get called by multiple different energy companies. They say, when can we come out to give you a free assessment? I welcome this, but it can be a little frustrating. You wanna get at least 3. You wanna make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. You wanna see kind of what estimates they give you based on the size of system that they recommend, and you'll see differences there. And that's why it helps in the first video to get a better understanding about what your energy demands is going into this conversation. Also, when you're comparing different energy companies, see what else they can bundle in with these costs. Again, if you're getting a percentage back in terms of a solar rebate cost, sometimes with other energy improvements like updating your air conditioning unit or getting a hybrid water heater, these are things that sometimes your electric company or the solar company can supply for you or subcontract with you. You can bundle that in and get additional percentages back. And again, it's a lot more efficient if you can save your upfront energy costs by making efficiency improvements at the start. So that's another thing to think about. Companies will throw in other things like insulation or heating fans. So just kind of keep that in mind. They provide nominal improvements, but nonetheless, if they're throwing it in, it's nice, but don't put any dollar value on that. Step 9, of course, you want to crunch the numbers. You want to look at all the different contracting estimates. You want to compare that with what we did in the last video. Other considerations are whether or not you want to finance through the contractor, through a separate financing company, through your bank, through your mortgage as a line of credit, or through a government energy program called a PACE, which is a Property Assessed Clean Energy Initiative that may be only applicable for certain contractors and only for certain scenarios. But basically what you're doing is you are bundling your additional costs into your mortgage payment like you would for your property insurance, your taxes, things like that, through escrow. You can get certain tax benefits if you do it that way. The downside is that it's tied in to your mortgage, and therefore I believe that there is an additional lien on the cost of the equipment, and if you were to default on the payment, they could seize your property. So keep that in mind, look at the fine print for those types of programs. Additionally, the interest rates we found were actually a little bit higher than if you finance separately. So even with the additional tax savings, it probably didn't make sense. And lastly, you don't have as much of a control or awareness as to what you're actually spending because it's all bundled together. So that brings us to our last point, which is be patient. This project will take some time, and the process of gaining efficiency improvements, doing a full assessment of your roof and all your appliances, and then going through the process of getting contractors into your home, sitting with them for 30 to 60 minutes, hashing out all the details, going through the negotiations, and then sitting back with your family members and crunching the numbers yourself, and then finding whether or not this actually makes sense and which contractor to go with is all really important. So I hope that this provided some insight into moving ahead with solar and things that we encountered on our journey early on in the process. So take a step back, know that this is going to take a few months, but it really is a wonderful thing if you can make it work. So if you have any questions, please comment below and consider subscribing. Thanks again. Bye.